Okay, I think we're live on YouTube, assuming this worked correctly.
Hello, everyone. There's no one there yet, surely.
All right, I'm going to take us live on the audio only thing. We need to do a sync clap too.
Okay, we'll do the sync clap.
All
We're
right.
going to go 3, 2, 1, clap.
Matt, I don't trust you to host this. You're rusty.
It's just counting. It's just because I've got it wrong so many times before, isn't it?
The funny ones are like, I've literally heard you describe this as we're going to go 3, 2, 1, and then you'll count 1, 2, 3, and people are like, what?
Oh,
What
really?
are you doing?
Yeah, that could
Like,
happen.
you don't think about it when you're doing it, but it's definitely happened. And I had to like just sit there and chuckle a little bit.
Oh, yeah. That's quite possible. But I stand by that, really, in a way. Because I feel like you should know that it's still counting. They're not like, whoa, what's this guy doing? Do you know what I mean? Shouldn't be that much of a surprise.
All right, so it's going to be 1, 2, 3,
Monday,
and then we're going to clap
Tuesday.
where 4 would be. So just try to like clap close to your mic. You just want a spike in the audio, essentially. All right, 1, 2, 3.
That's the best one I've ever seen.
Should be good.
That was perfectly in sync.
You two were synced good.
Like it was not in sync for. I was way off on my end, so we'll see what happens.
I think in mine, because I'm counting, you two both have the same delay coming from me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like on mine, you two are synced really well.
Okay. Are you going to tweet as well, John?
I'm supposed to.
You kind of have to. It's part of how this works, right?
I mean, at this point, I'm like, if people don't know we're live, they're just not listening. Not paying attention.
Well, yeah. That's the problem. If people don't know we're live, they're not listening.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. That should almost be on the
you get it.
The ticket.
Yeah.
People don't know we're live. They just aren't trying.
Yeah. Well, I just want to retweet it. So there are people watching, I think, now. So hello, everyone.
I see 11 watching. Yeah. Really, I'm waiting for you to tweet so that I don't have to. That's really
I didn't tag you in this, so I'm like super lazy with my live tweets. Unless I had it prepped already. Do I need to like go tag you in this?
No. Well, I mean, you should. It'd be nice. Just saying.
All right, let me go fix that.
I've retweeted it already, mate. Don't delete it.
I've already retweeted. Yeah,
I'm not deleting it.
We're committed at this point.
Yeah, we are live talking about Battlesnake.
17 people are watching, so they all know you did it anyway.
All right, well then we're good.
Great. All right, and I'm going to hang out in the Slack channel. So anyone that's watching, if you go to Gophers Slack, I'm going to be hanging out in there, and I'll ask questions to our panel. John,
I'm in there too, so I can drop some links and we can do some fun stuff.
I won't bother then, mate.
Yeah, I got it. I got it, Matt. Just take the day off.
Yeah. I'll just hang out. These are the best episodes, to be honest.
I mean, I picked a perfect one to actually crack a beer for, so I hope that doesn't like take us out of PG territory.
Yeah, what's the rating on this?
Yeah.
It's varied, is how I'll put it. There have definitely been some nuts. There've been some 4-letter words in past episodes, when generally that's not.
We get
it's not
told
necessarily
off for
bad.
it.
It's just not ideal.
They get bleeped out of the podcast, don't they?
Is that what they do? I don't know.
They must do, yeah. Because it's family friendly. We should do like go time late. Do you know what I mean? Where
like go time after hours.
Yeah, exactly. It's just
goes around all the terrible guests.
The hard part is, isn't it already after hours for you?
It's very late here. Yeah, I'm normally by this time swearing like a trooper.
I mean, after hours for you would be like, yeah, it's 4 a.m. here. I got my coffee and we're.
Yeah, probably.
All right, we can go ahead.
I'll phone you in the morning.
Don't phone me in the morning. It's all right. I don't like wake up calls.
Okay.
It's like one of the benefits of working for myself is that nobody needs me to get up early. I'm not a morning person at all.
Right. What are you in the morning?
Somebody who goes to sleep.
Do you work late then? Do you find you work late a lot?
I usually work a little bit later. Although, truthfully, lately I've been trying to just cut back and work a little bit less, which is hard, but trying to have
still stay up late.
Sometimes, but I mean, it depends. It really depends on what I do. If I'm like on my computer too late, it's just hard to get to sleep. But otherwise, it varies.
The thing is, like you clearly don't have kids, right? Because like once you have,
I do actually.
Wow, and you can sleep in.
So here's the thing. My wife gets up with our daughter and gives me
Oh.
like an hour to an hour and a half of sleeping. And my daughter does pretty good. These days she's usually not up till like 7:38. So that allows me to sleep till like maybe 9.
That's not bad. That's not bad at all.
But I mean, I also like it also helps in the sense that I don't generally shower before I start working or any of that. Like I basically go straight to work, make coffee, go to work, and then I'll like work out in the afternoon and then shower and then go back to work. So a little bit different from like a normal office scenario.
Welcome to the Go Time Late Show, where we're talking about what time you go to
John's
bed.
shower routine.
Personal hygiene.
I do shower. It just depends on when.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna kick this off
really
before we
pleased
go
you
too far.
shared that with us, John. Before we go too far.
All right. Hello and welcome to Go Time. Today we are joined by Brad Van Vugt, the founder of Battlesnake. How are you, Brad?
Hey, John. I'm doing pretty good. Doing pretty
Did
good.
I get the name right?
You got it right. Yeah, a lot of people don't, so full credit.
I always have to like make notes of like phonetically how to pronounce names. And I've forgotten once or twice, and then I like go to read and I'm just like, what do I say here? It's challenging sometimes. I've learned to just go ahead and just write these out real quick.
Yeah.
Good tip.
All right. We're also joined by Matt Ryer. Matt, it's been a while. How are you?
Oh, it's great to be back. I'm good, thank you.
How long has it been?
I don't know, but I've definitely missed everyone, especially you, Jack. John.
Right.
Thanks,
Nice.
thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
All right. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Battlesnake, game engines, and learning to code by building snake AIs, I guess.
Yeah.
So I guess let's just kick this off easily. Brad, tell us what Battlesnake is.
Yeah. So Battlesnake is a competitive programming game. And we kind of take a bunch of cues from esports and sort of like more video games and casual gaming. And so it's very much a community as well as a competitive programming environment. You can sign up on the platform. You can do a bunch of challenges on your own and try different sort of programming scenarios. Or you can join some of more of our competitive play in our leagues and our ranked play and tournaments and that sort of thing. But it's all based on the game Snake. So everyone that's participating is a developer, and they're building and writing and deploying effectively AIs, or in this case, just web servers that play the game on their behalf. And so all the games are fully automated, and you can kick off games and see how well you do against various communities.
Brilliant.
See, this is
How
an
fun
interesting.
does that sound?
It sounds fun. It's also like a weird, not weird, but it's definitely a new genre of games.
Yeah,
it's
Snake.
definitely evolved recently, because before that used to be like a crazy idea of like, let's have people program AIs for games, and now it's popping up a lot more often, I feel like.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's a lot of fun. I think that one of the things that we do differently, and it's not there are other versions of this popping up as well, but like we take a very esports sort of style to it, where we do shoutcasting, we have live rankings, we have a weekly Twitch show called Snake Pit Live, which is like a sports center style, like let's check in on who's entered the arena and who's knocked who out of first place and this kind of thing. And there's backstories and people are representing schools and nationalities, and so there's really sort of like this sport angle to it that I think is really fun about what we're doing.
Awesome. So going back to sort of what Battlesnake is, I've messed around with it a little bit, and as far as I can tell, you have several different modes. Some of them ranging, like you said, challenges that are essentially just keep your snake alive or complete some little objective, and a lot of those, correct me if I'm wrong, but almost seem like they're ways to get people sort of familiar with the environment and how things work. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's very much sort of like self-directed sort of familiarity with the platform and the game. The core sort of Battlesnake experience kind of kicks off once you get into ranked play, once you join a ranked arena or you join one of our leagues or our tournaments, and that's where things kind of are like, that's where that's where the real experience starts, and the challenges are there to get you going and to get you familiar with the core concepts and how you control your snake in an interesting and unique way. Yeah.
So let's say I did want to get into this. Like, what does the setup look like for me as a developer if I'm getting into Battlesnake?
Yeah. So I think this is another thing that makes Battlesnake unique. Typically a strong Battlesnake developer is typically already a programmer to some extent. That we're not necessarily teaching you to program. It's more taking people that know how to program a little bit and giving them sort of a venue to explore that on their own. So most Battlesnake developers have a little bit of programming under their belt. They're familiar with a sort of a common language. They've deployed some apps and they're kind of familiar with that process. And then the actual building of a Battlesnake, what you're doing is you're building or coding a web server to match an API. So it's kind of like a webhook API that we publish. And so you're actually programming the server side of the relationship. And the game engine, which kind of runs centrally and is heavily concurrent, is constantly sending web requests to your Battlesnake, which is represented as this live web server that's somewhere. It's a URL that's reachable. And so that's kind of what you're wanting to bring to the table, right? Like if you know a little bit about how to deploy an app, or you're looking to figure out how to deploy a web server, and you understand what a sort of a basic HTTP API might look like, that's a really good starting place to start getting involved. And we can talk about where it goes from there, but that's kind of the base level you want to be at.
So does the game play out in real time? It's making live calls to your server.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So the game itself, I can talk about why, because I think it's interesting, but we actually there's a timeout on the request. So you get a request from our game engine that says, here's the current game state. You're in this game. Here's what the board looks like. What's your move? And all of your opponents are going to get the same request in real time as well. And you have a 500 millisecond window to get your response back to us and back to the game engine. And your response is really simple. It's up, down, left, or right. It's which direction do you want to move? And you have a 500 milliseconds to decide that. But it's all happening in real time. And so if you don't hit that window, then your snake will just move forward sort of at your own peril. If you're watching the game in real time, if the battle snakes that are in the game are very fast, then the game plays back really, really fast. And then we actually have to, like, part of what we do on the platform is we slow games down to make it much more consumable to most people. So most of what you're seeing when you're interacting is actually replays, like buffered replays of pre-run games that usually happen 5 or 10 minutes ago.
Interesting. Yeah, because you could host your Battlesnake on the edge and really go fast.
Yeah, I can definitely see. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, like, we have some of the top tier competitors have figured out where we host the game engine out of just by spinning up servers in different data centers and different clouds, and so they've kind of triangulated where we are, and so they've happened to co-locate their Battlesnakes right next to the game engine to give them like maximum compute time, right? That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
So theoretically, if somebody was fast enough, they could actually play with their keyboard. They just have to respond within a set time frame every time.
So that's really interesting. So we didn't always have the 500 millisecond timeout. We've been doing this, I can get into the history a little bit, but we've been doing this for over 6 years now. And it kind of started as like a live in-person developer hackathon, where everyone would spend sort of the weekend building your Battlesnakes, then we'd run a big tournament at the end. And the second year we did it, we had one team that built a whole UI. So they had they were running their own client from their own server. They were WebSocketing the entire board state out. They were rendering it in JavaScript, and then accepting keyboard inputs and returning with like actually player controlled snake. At the time, the timeout was 5 seconds instead of 500 milliseconds. So it was very playable like that. And so we gave them credit. I think they took like second or third place in that tournament of like, great, if you got it. They still didn't win, which is ironic. But also speaks to like
robotic snake.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing.
It is. I agree. But you didn't hear that from me.
Yeah, cheating and then still losing. That's just come on. At least
I mean, they got second out of like 40 people, so that's not bad.
Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah,
that's pretty good. But they didn't get first. And so that's now we have variable timeouts. And so the default is sort of 500 milliseconds, but we also run game modes where you're only getting like 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds to kind of cut out opportunities for that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool.
I noticed when I was looking at the game, it also seemed like you could potentially play multiple games at once. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's very much part of the platform. And sort of as you explore and you start joining different ranked arenas and you start playing with different friends and people at your school, you learn that your Battlesnake can be in multiple games at any given time. And what we really like about this is it mimics like real web development, right? Like you have to, in order to be a competitive Battlesnake developer, you have to think about not only latency, which we talked about, but you have to think about concurrency, right? Of like, how can I be in multiple games at the same time and guarantee response times in all these different games so that I'm competitive? And so there's this really interesting natural progression of like, you start just by deploying a server that, you know, that just goes in a loop or just goes up or something like that. And then you get into concepts like concurrency, you get into concepts like code optimization, you get into concepts like co-location and data centers and this kind of stuff. And so it gets really advanced in a really sort of like gentle way.
I imagine this would also open the door for sort of like having a state on the server, which you can technically have at times, where you can sort of remember in this game, this is the move I took, and like here are what I think are the next possible states for the board. So you could almost like preemptively start trying to compute potential next options. Now, granted, with food being placed on a board, because for anybody who's played Snake, I'm assuming everybody has, but there's little food pieces that are placed on the board, and when you eat one, you grow a little bit longer, and they're placed randomly.
And so, is that your score as well?
I don't know if there's, I guess most Snake that's the score, but I don't know in Battlesnake if it's anything but just surviving.
So this is a mechanic we added sort of early on to make it competitive. I mentioned we've been doing this for a number of years. The first time we held it, there was no score, or sorry, there was no health. There's that whole health mechanic that we had to add, again, in response to players being creative. And so we learned that like you could be a very competitive Battlesnake if you just went in the corner and hid. And like that was a valid strategy, and everyone else would have eventually outgrow each other and run out of space. And so I think like a very competitive, this was the first year we did it, a very competitive strategy was just doing that. And so we implemented this health mechanic. So you have a set amount of health and you lose 1 health for every turn. And so you have to eat on a minimum cadence in order to survive and to stick around. And so we introduced that, and that's kind of what your score is. It's kind of like your length. The other interesting thing that we added with the health that's kind of, again, our own take on the classic game is for resolving head-to-head collisions. So if you go head-to-head with another Battlesnake, if you're both the same size, then you both get eliminated. But if you're longer, then the other player gets eliminated. And so this means there's this awesome trade-off between defensive and aggressive play. You can try to get food and try to gain length advantages, and try to outmaneuver your opponent. But the trade-off there is you start to run out of space sooner. So you have to be a lot more strategic in how you're maneuvering in order to pull that off.
So
but
people
the randomness of the food is what sort of like you can pre-compute a whole bunch of states, and a lot of people do, and then you just have to throw away the bad ones after food spawns.
Yeah, I was going to say that like that this technically could open up the doors to pre-computing a bunch of states, even when you don't have a web request in, just knowing you're in the middle of a game. Yep. And then when you get a response back, sort of deciding was one of those correct or not, and sort of moving from there, which could give you a huge advantage if you get things right, because then all of a sudden you could have a lot more pre-computed. But this, I mean, definitely is you've got to be at the high end of the like building your AI spectrum, because this is not like an intro level. You know, it's not where you would start out, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, you started with very simple strategies of like try to not run into myself and try to maybe find some food. And then it kind of grows from there. But we have, just to talk about the API a little bit, so you're getting requests for every turn, but you're also getting a request for the start and end of every game. And so that exists so you can do resource allocation. You can do asynchronous process spin up or spin down. You can do storage if you want, or cross request storage or persistent storage. And we have developers that do all of that stuff. And some of them take it really incredible levels of complexity in pre-computation. It's a really interesting, we think of it as solution space, but the solution space for what we're doing is very, very, very broad. And it just makes it like no one's doing the same thing. No one's doing the same thing. No one has the same strategy. Everyone's has their own flavor and their own creativity that they're bringing to the table, and it makes the community really, really fun to be a part of.
Is it difficult to get into if you want to start? Are we at the point like Call of Duty where the players on there now are just so good, it's almost no point even trying? How do you tackle that?
So we're not there yet, and it's kind of an open question as to whether or not we get there. We have new players show up all the time and just start dominating leaderboards because they're deploying strategies that either, learning algorithms haven't seen before, or they're learning a new way, or they're using a new strategy. Or oftentimes we have players show up with we think of them as hand-coded snakes, or hand-coded battle snakes that are employing strategies that the AIs haven't seen, or the AI players haven't seen yet. A really good example of this is, I'll tell a bit of a story. So we ran Fall League last September, and we had a new Battlesnake developer come in. No one had ever met them before, and their username was Tofu. This is what they called themselves. And they picked this like mid-beige like color, and their snake was like blocks on both ends. They really played up the theme. But they just started destroying leaderboards like all over the place. Like they were just winning game after game after game, and they were knocking out top tier multiplayer or top tier multi-year Battlesnake developers. And we didn't know anything about this person. So we were like live casting games, we're on Twitch, we're talking about strategies, but we have no idea what tech they're using and how they're going about this. And then we had one developer from the community study Tofu's games, like game after game after game, and they identified a very specific situation in which Tofu was vulnerable. And so they programmed a Battlesnake to not like to at all costs try to force this situation. And it was a situation where like Tofu would go against the wall in a way that was not disadvantageous for itself. And then if you caught this scenario, then you could cut it off really, really quickly. And so this one developer named Smallsco actually created a Battlesnake specifically for taking out Tofu, and they could beat Tofu regularly with this strategy. Their Battlesnake was terrible at beating anyone else, but they could beat this one top tier competitor semi-reliably because they had identified this weakness.
Oh, that's so cool, isn't it?
I imagine this is where Battlesnake starts to shine for experienced developers. You talked about like people who've been playing this for a while. Are people actually taking like machine learning strategies and applying it to this? Is that what you mean by people who've like never seen a strategy before and they lose early on to it?
Yeah, we're starting to see some AI and some reinforcement machine learning strategies being deployed. I think what's interesting, they tend to not be hyper competitive, except in the Tofu case. And the reason I bring up that is because we don't actually know what Tofu was doing. We never actually met them. They destroyed Fall League, and then they retired. And I think you can still find their profile on the website, and they changed their background to just be like, or their backstory to just be like officially retired as of this year. But we're starting to see more AIs or machine learning strategies pop up, but it's not really like the community that follows this isn't about being the top tier competitor. It's not about winning. It's about using this as a venue to try different things. So a lot of our developers are using this as a reason to get into reinforcement learning, to start looking at things like TensorFlow, or even to learn new cloud platforms. Like if you're looking for a reason to try GCP, or you're looking for a reason to try or to get into Rust and see what it's like to program a web server in Rust, that's the primary use case that we're finding. It's more about a really interesting feedback mechanism and a really interesting way to explore a new language or a new technology, where you can see progression, right? Sort of on your own terms.
Yeah, and I've noticed that like as far as the learning goes, you have a process that's relatively easy to jump into, at least for Go. I haven't looked at the other languages, but the Go process was literally you say you want to start building in Go and you have a REPL REPL.it if anybody's never used it. Basically, it allows you to clone your project like you'd clone a GitHub repo, but it's cloned on this like self-contained development environment where you can literally just hit the run button and you have a URL to connect to your Battlesnake and you just paste it into the Battlesnake website and you have something running. Now, to be fair, it's a very bad AI. I think it chooses its moves randomly, so it kills itself a lot. But
still
basically,
better than a lot of AI.
Well,
yeah,
but it's you've got something that it's at least running, and you can verify like my code is connected to the server, and it gets you past all of those initial hurdles, which historically with programming and learning to code and getting into something, usually that's the biggest barrier is like just getting started. And then from there, like it's an awesome starting point, which I've noticed like REPL and like other things like that are awesome tools for getting people involved. And something that would otherwise take a lot of effort.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the ways that what we're doing sort of shines, right? So like Replit is a partner of ours. They like, they support what we do and we're fans of what they're doing. But also like we have tutorials if you want to use Heroku. We're working on a tutorial now if you want to use Railway. The AWS team, there's an open source Battlesnake that was made using AWS SageMaker by the AWS SageMaker team that they built. And it's just to show off of like, hey, if you want to try this, here's a really interesting way to try it. And so what we're starting to see is the community is really giving back to us in that regard of like they're making pooling, we think of them as starter projects or like starting repos that have a lot of the sort of infrastructure in place, so you can just get to programming, quicker, right? Which is kind of the
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea that AWS are using it. I imagine Google are going to do it. Maybe it could end up being a good way to settle IP disputes.
Yeah, 100%. That would, was like, let's just take this to Battlesnake and we'll see what happens.
Battlesnake it out. Yeah,
it's interesting. So I mentioned we run leagues. We ran a spring league earlier this year, and the AWS team actually entered the league as an official AWS team. I think it was a team out of the Vancouver office. And they got 39th. They got 39th out of like 300 developers. Like they didn't even come in like top 20. But now they're fired up, right? And they're like, oh, okay, we can't stand for this. And so we have other companies.
Cloud platform.
Yeah, maybe they should switch. Cloud platform.
I'm not
gonna say that.
Fluffed it.
But yeah, so now we have other large companies that are coming in and they're like, hey, can we submit, like our engineering team wants to play, right? Like, what does this look like? And that just makes it more fun. Like it makes it fun for everyone else competing as well.
Yeah. Is it good for like a team building thing? Someone in the Slack channel, Gophers Slack, the Go Time FM channel, mentioned that they used it as a team building thing. So that, I bet it is great for that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really fun. And we have some tools for that, and we help a couple, like it's not really our core effort, but we have sort of larger engineering teams that have come in and been like, hey, can we run one of these things? And sometimes what we'll do is we'll run a little mini tournament for them, and sometimes we can put them on Twitch if we're allowed, which is really fun. But sometimes we just run it privately for them as well. And then what we'll try to do is get the winners from those to come back into the community, and we'll get them on, one of our shows, or we'll get them on Twitch, or we'll get them into a tournament that we're running. And kind of like part of this is making the developers feel like rock stars, right? Like it should feel really cool if you win one of these things. It should be really cool if you develop this Battlesnake that is particularly good at destroying tofu. We want you to feel like a hero in our community because of that, right?
Yeah. I wonder if that Battlesnake that beat tofu was funded by Big Beef.
Oh boy. So when people are like getting into this learning process, I've noticed you have the challenges. Do you want to sort of expand a little bit on what those are and how they help people get started?
Yeah. So the challenges are kind of a new thing, and they're kind of constantly evolving. It's really, we see the challenges as sort of like a bridge to get you into competitive play, because multiplayer play is where multiplayer games is where the strategies start to get really interesting. Like it's not terribly challenging or difficult to write an AI that can do well in the game Snake all by yourself, right? Like it's, after a bit of effort, you can get something that survives most of the time. And then you're just dealing with edge cases. And so the challenges exist as sort of like this bridge of like, okay, let's talk about how you avoid yourself. Let's talk about how you get food. Let's talk about how you avoid walls. There's an interesting challenge where you can actually go up against yourself. And our goal there is, again, to introduce the idea of concurrency, right? Of like, now here's a challenge where your server is actually playing two snakes on the same board, and you're trying to outmaneuver yourself. But what does that do to your latency? What does that do to your processing power? Let's introduce you to that, and then gradually bring you into more competitive multiplayer play.
Oh, it's genuinely getting me excited about doing this. Yeah, sorry, John, you were going to say something.
No, I guess the next questions I'd have are like this is a great way to learn, like you said, learn new languages, try out deploying to new servers. Have you guys sort of thought about like, I guess more of like the pros and cons, like areas where this shines versus areas where this is maybe not the best learning tool? Like one of them you mentioned was if you're a beginner to programming in general, this is probably not the best fit because it's not going to teach you like a Hello World server. You're kind of expected to have a little more experience in that. Are there other like use cases where it shines versus ones where it's not quite as great?
I mean, there's some obvious ones. Like we don't do really well with front end, right? Like obviously there's no front end programming involved in this, and it has to be basically sort of web based dev. But beyond that, like if you think of it as like web backend development, once you're in that area, basically anything goes. But I will sort of underscore that, like, if you're looking to learn to program, there's lots of things out there that are really good at that. There's lots of things that take a gamified approach to it. There's lots of people out there that want to teach you to program, and that's not really what we're doing, right? Like what we're doing is you're a level 1 programmer, you're a junior intermediate programmer, and you're looking for a reason to try something new. You're looking for a venue to sort of program recreationally, and that's sort of our core. And we didn't do that on we didn't set out on purpose to provide that. That's just that tends to be the type of developers that want to play, and so we've learned to kind of lean into that.
I've noticed this type of game is very, very good for like solidifying your reasoning and logic skills, whereas where one of the areas I've seen this type of thing not do that well are things like if you want to get into code structure and building like a really large scale application, this doesn't necessarily teach you the skills to organize code and work with a team in that sense, because a lot of the time, like if you're trying a new strategy out, you might whip some code together real quick thinking, let's see how this goes. And I'm probably going to throw this code away because it doesn't work.
Yeah.
You and I were talking though at one point about one of the areas, it was before we got on air, about one of the areas that this could potentially go is sort of the testing realm. And this happened before we recorded this. I was trying to make a Battlesnake myself, and I found myself really, really wanting to have a case where I could take a sort of a test game state and be like, all right, if I give this to my game, what does it do? Does it do what I want it to do? And it would be great to have some sort of way to give it a game state without having to like manually construct everything that would be in the JSON, but the whole request payload. And then to actually test your code and say, like, does this give me the response? And Brad, I believe you said that the community built some tools sort of like this.
Yeah. I mean, I think of it as like, this is your Battlesnake AI is very easily unit testable. Like it lends itself, like the inputs and the outputs are very, very well defined, right? Of like, given this game mode, if up is the only valid, or given this game state, if up is the only valid move, then I better return up 100% of the time. And so you can add the sort of unit tests. I mentioned the idea of like, we found that Battlesnake development kind of follows this natural progression of web development as a whole. Like you start to think about latency, you start to think about performance and concurrency, but you also start to think about unit testing, because that's or specifically regression testing, because that's a really easy way to make sure that you're not harming your AI as you continue to develop. We would love to, we have an endless backlog of things that we would like to do in this realm, but to touch on what you mentioned specifically, The community has done a phenomenal job. Like we have a Discord server, we have a open source GitHub repos. There's a large community that sort of follows this and participates, and they've started to give back tools to the community. So someone built, I think they called it a board generator, but basically it's like a little UI where you can paint a board state onto you can add snakes and paint their locations, and then you can export that as a fake JSON game request, and then you can say like, okay, now import this as a test case that I want to hit against.
Very cool.
We've also had someone built like a desktop app that actually lets you run games against a local snake. So one of the interesting things is because everything's live, you have to, in order to test changes, you have to deploy your snake, which it just dramatically draws out iteration time. But now there's tools where you can run CLI games locally. You can use this desktop. It's called Mojave if you're looking for it. But you can run local games against your Battlesnake locally and test out different scenarios, and you can pause and rerun frames and this kind of thing. So it's really interesting to see what the community is doing to kind of support this test-driven development.
That to me is like a really cool introduction to that test-driven development and learning the value of tests, because like you said, with regression tests and some of that, tutorials are often hard because they either have to simplify things so much that they don't really help you in the long term, or it's such a complicated application that you really don't understand everything. Whereas this one's one where there's just enough complication that you really understand what's going on, but it's simple enough that you clearly see, like, obviously, if going this direction has caused me issues in the past. And you mentioned the one case of like, if the only way to not die is to go up, then you want to go up. But there's also like other cases that aren't quite as like they're not as clear cut in that specific moment, but you want tests for them. I guess example I can give is when I was making my snake, I found that one of the things like when I was messing around with different strategies, one of the things you could easily do is like sort of make a U shape with your snake and then try to travel inside of it. So you essentially box yourself in, and you don't necessarily die in that first move, but you will eventually die. So as you start to realize these cases, you can start to be like, I need a test case to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. And like the development process is really natural in that sense. It's like, okay, the first thing I want to do is just not die or not run off the board. The next thing I want to do is not starve to death. The next thing I want to do is, not go into another snake. And then you slowly add these things, and they can all be test cases that have like, what do I do in this particular case? And it's a really cool progression, similar to the natural development cycle.
Yeah, and it's a really natural progression too. One of our team members, her name's Aurora, and she always says like the first 4 steps of Battlesnake are like, first of all, like don't hit walls, don't hit yourself, don't hit other snakes, and then eventually try to find food. And that's kind of like, if you watch someone build a Battlesnake for the first time, that's always the steps they take, and it's typically in that order as well. So we're looking, this is like the challenge is kind of like us leaning into that a bit more. We're starting to produce more content around how to achieve those first 4 steps. We've also thought about adding some more base level code to the projects that we publish. You mentioned that like I think the Go starter project just moves randomly, but we could start adding maybe some helper functions to do distance calculations or to do A-star pathfinding or this kind of thing. Not solve the problems for you, but give you some of the tools that you're probably going to want to use, right?
Yeah,
so let you apply them.
So another thing we've sort of talked about is, I believe you mentioned that you have a CLI for running this locally. And if I recall correctly, that's written in Go, which also means that essentially your entire game engine is written in Go then. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, yes, it is. And most of it is open sourced. So if you go to our GitHub, and I think it's called the rules repo, but the entire game logic is implemented in Go and is open source so that anyone can see it. We get this a lot where people, developers are eliminated in cases where they don't necessarily think it was fair or whatever, and so we're able to like point to source code that says, well, everyone's, we're running this code. You can take a look at it and see exactly what's happening. And a lot of devs like to look at the source code to debug like order of operations in the game engine to figure out exactly when when food consumption happens, when does elimination detection happen, so that they can program against these super tight edge cases. And with that, again, the community built a little CLI tool for running games locally, and so that's baked into that repo, and that's all written in Go, which didn't really. We chose to write the game engine in Go because that was something we were familiar with, but I think it turned out to be a really phenomenal choice, and the community has really leaned into it.
How was, like, as far as writing a game engine in Go, have you ever written one in another language, or can you compare that to anything else?
I think that this is so unique. It's so unique in that the entire game engine is web-based and web request based. So typically, like, if you're writing a game engine, it's kind of its own thing. I've written like toy game engines, as most devs kind of do at some point in their career, using like Python or more scripting languages, or sometimes Lua based. But I think this setup is pretty unique. And we originally chose Go mostly for performance, because if you look at what the engine's required, like what's required of the engine, it's all very basic. Like, I'm going to say some things that obviously lend themselves towards choosing Go specifically, but very basic structures, very basic communications, but super high concurrency and super high performance requirements. So you're looking at, if we've got a game that's running, an average game is going to have 4 different players in it, and we're running 100, 200 games at any given time. That's a lot of processing power and a lot of synchronous IO to handle. And so Go obviously makes that a lot simpler than it would be in other languages. For example, the original game engine was actually written in Python, like old Python G event loops, and it was just a real pain to figure out what was actually happening. We rewrote it 4 years ago.
Okay. So I guess my follow-up question to this would be, you said you needed this to be open source so people could look at it and actually see what's going on. And as Go developers, we often claim that Go is easy to read and consume, and that's one of the perks of it. Has this generally been true, given that I'm assuming that a huge chunk of your audience and people playing the game don't actually write Go code?
I think that's an interesting question. I've never heard of anyone we've never received complaints that the engine has been written in Go. So I would tend to agree with that and be like, for most developers, they can probably understand what's going on. We've also gone to great lengths, obviously, to like document the open source stuff fairly well and kind of explain the high level blocks that are in play. But I think that the simplicity of the language, the simplicity of the implementation, definitely lends itself to be readable by most developers, even if they're not Go developers specifically.
So following up to this, or Matt, did you have a question?
That's all right. Go for it.
The one thing I did notice was that because this is written in Go, I feel like Go developers have a slight advantage in the sense that they can then take the game engine or the rule set, and if they're trying to actually like play out like what are the next possible 10 steps, like depending on what moves are, and like basically just doing a brute force sort of approach of play the next 10 steps and see which of my moves would be best. You can do this pretty easily. Like I say pretty easily. You can do it probably more easily in Go because you can actually import that code and you have a game engine running inside of your code and you can sort of work from there. Has that actually proven to be the case where like ones written in certain languages are more performant than others?
I wouldn't necessarily say performant, but I would say like there's a clear advantage to being able to run the actual game logic within your AI, within your bot. I think that we've had.
You mean while they're actually battling?
Yeah. So what you'll do is like you can simulate future game states and then use the game engine in real time to resolve those game states and to resolve those moves. Cool. And it gets really, and so this is, speaking of like natural Battlesnake progression, I think this is kind of a more advanced level, but we do see it a lot. And a lot of developers will start to implement early versions of game logic themselves into whatever language they're doing. But we also there's an ongoing project right now in the community to have the game engine cross compile to WebAssembly. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but that exists so that it would kind of maybe take down that barrier and allow anyone to start importing and running the rules locally. I think there's obviously performance hits attached to that. And if you choose to write your Battlesnake in Go, then there's clear advantages because the game engine itself is in Go. But I don't necessarily know that that's a hurdle, right? It's just kind of, again, like part of what we really like about this is if you get to the stage and you start thinking about, okay, how do I, the game engine is actually, or the rule engine is actually written as an importable Go module. So you can just add it as a dependency to your app. And so you can start to think about things like, okay, how do I add this as a dependency? How do I call it to the library? How do I measure the performance of it? And again, those are all real world software development scenarios and questions that a professional developer will regularly ask themselves. And so if you're willing to take a WebAssembly version or a cross-compiled version of this, like what are the trade-offs, right? Like we kind of want you to go through that. I think again, that's what makes this compelling.
I guess, yeah. I wonder if people have done things like fuzzing as well with that technique. Probably, right? Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of an early strategy will just be to like select moves randomly, play out as many as you possibly can into the future, build a tree, prune the ones where you're losing, and then select the one where you survive the longest, right? And that's kind of like that's a level. I think of that as like an early look ahead strategy. But you learn very quickly that like that takes a lot of compute because of the multiplayer nature of the game, because everyone's moving on the same turn. So even looking one turn ahead, you need to run 4 times 4n different states to look at that, and then that just explodes once you start to consider food, like random food.
And of course you don't know what other players are going to do you?
Yeah, you like, I imagine you could get into a point where you could assume everybody's playing optimally, but like that might also hurt your AI in the sense that not everybody is necessarily going to use your strategy and play optimally based on your strategy. So it could just be weird all around. So like you almost need to like put a bunch of weights into everything as to like, I don't really know what's going to happen.
We have, again, very top tier players that adjust those weights based on their opponents as well. So like if they recognize in the request, you get the name of your opponents. And if they recognize a name, they'll be like, well, I know that this player tends to like the safe defensive strategy would have them move this way, but I know that they tend to be more aggressive and a little bit more risky in their play. And so I'm going to weight accordingly. And I'm going to take that into consideration. And then that player can then counter, there's this counter play that kind of goes back and forth. Right. So the like long term, the game gets closer to something like, I guess like rock, paper, scissors, right? Where you can kind of counter moves. There's no AI that's going to win every game. That's not possible.
I definitely noticed some of that when I first started setting up my AI, and one of the first things you almost always, I'm assuming most people do when you start looking at other snakes, is if I move here and another snake moves here, well, you're like, well, we could both potentially die depending on, like you said, snake length and stuff. And at the time, I didn't even know about snake length, so I wasn't really sure what would happen. So I'm just like, let's just avoid this move altogether.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing most people do this. So early on, if you're thinking about it, you could probably safely go there knowing that most AIs are not going to take that chance. But like you said, there could be some snakes that you realize are super aggressive there, and you're like, ooh, I don't want to risk that right now. So there's definitely a lot of factors that could go into that, deciding what to do.
Yeah, I think that so we've run in competitive play. There's a couple different tiers and ranks. So there's like bronze, silver, gold, and then platinum and elite. And elite is typically sort of like the top 16 players at any given time. We try to sort of keep that capped. But the silver and the gold play is really interesting because you start to see like the way you break out of those tiers is you start to realize that those trade-offs are being made by everybody, and you start to realize that you can take advantages of those. So if I know if I'm in a gold tier and I'm up against gold tier competitors, I know that you're probably going to shy away from head-to-head collisions because you haven't considered that. You haven't considered the future states in which you could win those. And so I can use that to be, extra aggressive, or I can use that to outmaneuver you in different situations. It's really interesting to watch like how gold play lends to platinum play, how lends to elite play.
I assume those also like are a way of making the game accessible, because Matt had asked earlier if this was like Call of Duty, where essentially there's no point in starting. And I've noticed the games that do that tiered model, especially esports type games, like you might not notice it playing, but as a spectator, you can generally tell by watching the things that somebody does, or like in this case, a Battlesnake does, which tier they're probably going to fall into. Like my own personal experiences, I played StarCraft for a while, and I kind of learned that you could be really bad at managing units in a battle, but as long as you like got the macro production stuff right, you could get to a pretty high tier, because it just didn't matter as long as you could keep fighting over and over again. Like the other small things didn't matter as much. And I'm assuming in Battlesnake it ends up being similar, where as long as your AI takes care of certain things, it'll eventually get out of certain tiers, and this allows people to like start in the low tiers beginners and then gradually move their way up.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we use like most of the team is StarCraft players. We've all played StarCraft at some point. I think StarCraft is a really apt analogy for that sort of progression, right? And so like an example is for gold play, most people are, there's no look ahead. Most people are operating in a stateless fashion. They're not, doesn't have to be stateful to be look ahead, but they're only computing on the current board state. And so you'll see, general behavior optimizing for self-survival, right? Of like, how do I survive as long as possible in this situation? I'm just trying to avoid everything and not get myself into dangerous situations. And you start to see things like A-star pathfinding or flood fill, and these kind of algorithms to detect the self, the traps, right? Like the self-trap scenarios that you pointed out. And then kind of as you break out of that, then you start to get into the higher tiers. Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this super, super interesting.
Yeah, there's a great documentary about DeepMind doing the game Go. And they also you can find it online, there are videos of it playing StarCraft. And they noticed when they were watching it, that they would put them up against world-class players, and they realized that the AI would make silly little mistakes, things which if a player had made that mistake, you'd think this person's not going to win now. They've made this kind of schoolboy error. But then the AI goes on to win, and it turns out it just sort of didn't matter.
That doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah. In the end, does that happen in Battlesnake? Do the snakes act weird?
Yeah, and I think I have a really interesting example of this. And these are hand-coded snakes, so I'll add that like these aren't necessarily machine learning or reinforcement learning developed, but the 2019 before COVID we used to run in-person events, and it was really fun, and we had shoutcasters and DJs and stuff like that. The in-person 2019 championship, we had one competitor, and they were called Undefined Behavior. Their Battlesnake was called Undefined Behavior, and they entered it into the it was then called the Veteran, which was the top tier division. And they actually had accidentally coded a strategy that actively avoided food. And this is the first time that we'd ever seen this. And so they started to, like, the casters are trying to cast this game, and they're like, and you can watch it, it's all on Twitch, like you could watch the VOD, you can have it in real time, and the casters don't know what to do with it, because this top tier veteran Battlesnake developer is like, just looks like it's going to starve out. Like, it's doing everything it can possibly do to not consume food. And then at the very last second, it would somehow make it out. It would somehow make it out of these situations. And so like, we were all like, this is silly. Like, how is this snake? Like, why is this even playing in the veteran division? But then they just kept winning games repeatedly, like winning games and defeating other people, because they were just letting their opponents would just get too long, and they weren't able to maneuver. And they ended up taking first place. And the finals broadcast for that tournament is like one of the best Battlesnake moments we've ever had, because no one expected much of this snake. No one expected it to do well, but this one developer had sort of accidentally stumbled into this very interesting macro strategy of just try to stay as short as possible for as long as possible. and it was like a $5,000 prize pool that they took home because it was crazy.
Wow, I can smell a Netflix special coming on with this. It sounds so dramatic,
Like
doesn't it?
follow a year of like a top tier Battlesnake developer. It's like the Tofu documentary.
Battlesnake. Yeah, it's just the Battlesnake you follow.
Yeah.
He's the star. Yeah, the
Games
Tofu.
are
No
always
one knows who it
interesting.
is. I love it.
I love it.
I love when you throw games into the mix with AI because we all have this like preconceived notion of like what is good play in certain games, and then we quickly realize that the things we cared about might not actually matter in the grand scheme of things, and it's really hard to. It's just hard to figure out like what what actually is the case and what isn't.
Yeah.
Because that StarCraft one you mentioned, Matt, I remember seeing that too, and it's always challenging to see because you'd wonder if pro players could actually learn from that type of thing, taking AI from games and watching them and deciding like, is my entire strategy based on the wrong, like, am I, prioritizing things incorrectly? And we could see, sort of what goes from there. Now, granted, there might also be the case where an AI might be able to click or do something that's inhuman. So,
right.
No, they actually made sure that this couldn't in the StarCraft case with DeepMind. They made sure it could only see what the other player can see, and it could only interact, I think, at a slower rate, like one click.
Oh, really?
The click rate is always weird.
Yeah.
I know the click rate's always weird because if you've ever watched a pro player play, they click a million times without doing anything. I feel like
they're sort of keeping warm, agile. Aren't they?
It's and like I'm like, what does this actually translate into? Like, what is their actual click rate of like useful moves and
like actions per minute versus clicks per minute?
Like, what is the actual useful number, and like, does that actually matter? I'd be curious to see if you could take AIs and just bring that as low as possible to see like, does this make a difference in pro play or not? Like that's the type of thing it'd be really fun to do with DeepMind if you were, if you had the opportunity to.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting component of this. So looking back to like DeepMind playing StarCraft or even like OpenAI playing Dota, right? Like they were doing a very similar sort of show mat there. It's really inaccessible for most people to watch those things and understand what it's like, unless you're like at this intersection of understanding how AI works and then also understanding how StarCraft 2 works mechanically at a very high level. It's really hard to appreciate and understand what's going on. And one of the things where we kind of, again, we didn't set out to do this, but like Snake itself it's hyper accessible because the mechanics are so simple, right? Like you're just moving up, down, left, or right. And so we can start to watch these things unfold. Like we can watch this unconventional strategy completely disrupt these highly developed AIs, and everyone in the audience understands why, right? Versus just like we don't have to go debug and debrief and figure out like, okay, how did it's not like the pro StarCraft 2 player like watching the replay and trying to figure out where the advantages came. We all see it. We all see it happen in real time, and we understand where the deficiencies were.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Snake is like, we didn't even like describe the Snake game because I think we all just assumed everybody's played it before because it's been on every device. Like I think every early cell phone had Snake in it. Well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of them did. But there was calculators and everything else that had Snake that I can think of.
Yeah. Like we think of it as like it's universally recognizable, right? Which is kind of, again, not something we did it because it was fun, but it turned out to be like this really interesting aspect of it. I mentioned we used to do live in-person events and show matches and tournaments, and like those events, like they drew a crowd. Like we had people in the community who were not programmers and just wanted to come out and watch because it was really fun to watch, and you could see what was going on. Versus again like a StarCraft 2 esports, right? Like most people who are watching that are either StarCraft fans or StarCraft players. But we're there's a really interesting non-programmer based audience for what we're doing.
Yeah, I could see that. If I wasn't a programmer, I'd watch it.
Yeah,
it's I've seen some other games like it, and I definitely think there's I'm really interested in the space of programming AIs for games because I've seen some other companies that do the whole, it's essentially meant to teach you programming, and it goes, it's kind of hit or miss sometimes. I feel like sometimes there's some big leaps that are hard, but there's even some games around that. Isn't there like something billion humans or something like that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I'll find
Or
out.
even like things like Slither or Generals was the other one, where like it was kind of, it started out as like a human played game, but at the end of the day, everyone was writing bots for it. Like that's just how it ran. Or you can also look at things like Screeps is a really interesting example, which is like a full Steam based game where I think you upload your JavaScript and they run it for you, and it's all fully autonomous, but it's more of like an open world. Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting things cropping up in the space.
Yeah, 7 billion humans was that game. It's not quite the same thing, but it is.
It like gets you used to those concepts of programming. It's not the same as programming, but it's like an awesome introduction for, like, the way I described it was like if I wanted to get my nephews into programming without like telling them that's what they're doing, I'd be like, go play this game, and then afterwards you'd be like, you're basically programming.
Yeah, you really are. You literally have if statements and things where you give logic into a little character, and they've got to find their way home. And there's not 7 billion of them, so the title is a little bit misleading there. I only counted 6.4 billion when I counted them.
Yeah, that game was even interesting in the sense that it like, didn't it even tell you if you had like the shortest code possible or the fastest code possible? Like, it did some programming-esque type things that programmers, for whatever reason, care about these things.
Yeah,
some of them make sense, like latency or like speed can matter, but like whether your code's the shortest code possible is something that weirdly programmers like to check.
Yeah, I mean,
was there
that
like
7 billion
score and
humans...
like experience attached to that? Like,
yeah, so like once you'd finish a level, it would like show you like whether, if I recall correctly, it would sort of show you like you were this close to sort of the fastest solution or like this close to the shortest solution, and sometimes those weren't the same and sometimes they could be the same.
Right.
So
right.
you'd like, it sort of force you to go back and try it different ways and sort of see what's possible.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really fun. I mean, that's for people who aren't programmers. Anyone can play that.
Yeah, it's definitely, anybody can play that game. It gradually introduces you. As a programmer, you still play, like I've still played it some and found it interesting, but it is hard to, it took me a while, or it took me, it was hard for me to sit down and just play the whole game through, is how I'd put it, because it sometimes did feel like programming, like, because it was so relatable.
Yeah, that's
All
how
right.
you program in your real life. You've got an IDE that's just little blocks you move around, isn't it? It's adorable.
Yeah, that's everyone at Google is just doing that. It's just like search blocks.
The big thing.
Yeah.
The data blocks.
Yeah.
All right, we're running near the end of the episode, Brad, so we're going to move over to your unpopular opinion. At this point, they'll insert some music. So tell us, what is your unpopular opinion?
So I don't know how unpopular this is, but it's something that I've started a couple different companies. I've co-founded a couple different companies. Battlesnake is the one that I'm sort of currently operating. It's the one I love the most, absolutely. But as I built teams and tech teams and engineering teams, I've become a really big fan of non-negotiable job offers, especially at early stage. It's like I've hired a lot of developers over my career, and it just feels way better for both sides of the relationship when job offers are made sort of open and transparent, and everyone's kind of putting their chips on the table right away of like, I don't want to play this game of negotiating benefits or negotiating salary. And oftentimes developers don't want to do that either, right? Or it doesn't even have to be developers, but early stage tech hires don't want to do that either. So I'm a firm believer that, you know, those job offers should be non-negotiable, because it just builds trust. It builds so much trust on both sides. I can talk about that further, but that's where I want to start.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I suppose one effect it has is people. I've forgotten what I was going to say. Oh, ridiculous. Sorry.
Well, I mean, it tends to be like, if you have negotiable job offers, it tends to favor those that understand that they can negotiate, or those that have the social skills to do so, and not everyone does. And I think that's a really garbage situation to learn that someone, you know, with the same job title as you received a higher comp package just because they asked for it and you didn't, right? Like what does that say about the team and the company at a high level.
I can imagine it's also, we don't think about it that much, but I could imagine this also affecting people's salaries based on their backgrounds. For instance, somebody who has their parents paying for their college and can afford to turn down a job offer or try to negotiate, with those risks involved,
right,
versus somebody who's like, I just graduated with $100,000 in debt. I don't really have, like, I can't take the risk of upsetting them by asking for more money, or that might be what's going through their head. I think in practice, job offers are probably rarely rescinded for trying to negotiate, but there's always that risk, and that could potentially mean that people who are already coming into the work environment with a like slight handicap by not having parents who can pay for their score or their school. I say slight,
right.
that's a pretty big handicap, but if you're coming in with that handicap, it just sort of further amplifies it.
Yeah, and I suppose also, like I know from hiring myself that on average, women, female candidates would ask for about 10% less than men would for whatever reason. So I suppose it helps like that. By the way, when that happened, I would tell them because I'm a feminist hero. But I suppose it helps there, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think of it as like if you're doing non-negotiable job offers, you should be giving your best offer up front, right? You know what I mean? Like you shouldn't be using non-negotiable job offers as a money-saving tactic. I think that's kind of the wrong way to do it. But you should be giving everyone the best offer that you can, regardless of their background, of their experience level, if they're underrepresented minorities or whatever. Everyone gets your best offer. And what I also think is interesting is it really puts the onus on the hiring team to perform well and to make sure that like we're getting great people through and that we're getting a diverse pipeline. And everyone's going to get, if you can decide on what the comp package is before hiring, then it takes that entirely out of the process, right? We know what this role is, we know what we're going to pay them, and now we need to find someone who matches that and is looking for that, versus like we're just looking for anyone and we'll pay them whatever, we'll pay them the minimum amount they're willing to agree to, right? Which is
right.
Yeah.
It's I guess it would also eliminate that whole like, if we can get this person at this rate, it's a yes, but otherwise it's like it kind of gets rid of that whole in between type state of trying to decide, is it worth it or not? And like I do like what you said about figuring out the role and what it's worth to you ahead of time, versus I think that'd be the hard part with the non-negotiable offers, is that there's a lot of orgs that, like a Google, for example, hires, my phone's deciding to think I'm saying, okay, Google. But basically when one of those companies are hiring, they aren't hiring for a specific role. So it's a really weird situation. It's not like you go in saying I'm hiring for, sales lead at this specific project. But if they were forced to come up with actual salary ranges up front and have non-negotiable offers, I feel like that would be more useful in that sense, because you'd know what you were going in for.
Yeah. And along those lines, if you're doing this, you never have to ask, like there's always that question of like, what are your salary expectations, or what did you make in your last, you know what I mean? Or like employers will always find sneaky ways to ask that question of what you were paid in your current or your previous role. And you always have to like train, interviewees to navigate that question and be ready for it. And this takes that question entirely out of the process, right? This is what the package is. I'm telling you right now, it's our best offer. And we think that you fit that. And either, it's something that you're willing to accept or not, but there's no conversation of like, well, is it a bump over what you used to make? Is it, can we get less because you were undervalued previously? It takes that off the table as well.
Has it ever backfired? Have you ever regretted it? Have you ever lost somebody that you wish you hadn't?
Yeah, totally. Like we've lost, when I say we, in previous companies, but I've had strong candidates turn down offers, and I've learned to be very upfront with that early on in the process. Like if you interview someone and you think it's a fit, have that compensation conversation very early with them to make sure that no one's wasting anyone's time on either side. And if that doesn't align, then move on. A stronger example of, I wouldn't say backfiring, because I think that's too tough language, but there was a position that I was hiring for, and we had decided up front what the comp package was going to be, and we just, we lost 3 or 4 really great candidates who decided that it wasn't for them. And what we ended up doing is we had to increase the comp package. But what that came with is we actually also increased comp packages of the existing team as well to match, right? Of like, okay, we can't, you're all at this role, you're all at this level. We can't hire great people on your current comp package at this level. So clearly something's wrong. So let's bring everyone up to a level that we can actually hire great people at, and assume that, we don't want to punish existing team members because they chose a lower salary 2 years earlier, right? And the market's changed.
Yeah, or they joined earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Which should be rewarded. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's the opposite way around. Yeah, very interesting. I wonder if that's going to be unpopular or not. I don't know. We will test this on our Twitter account at GoTimeFM. We'll ask the people. We'll find out what they think. Very interesting, though.
It's a weird one for me because I don't know where I stand on it fully. Like I've seen some companies that the one that comes to mind is not a GitLab they were remote for the longest time, and they had, I think it was basically like specific price bands that, I don't know if it was exactly this, but they did something where like your location was affecting your salary and some other stuff that I didn't fully agree with. And it essentially came down to the point that I could never work there because I would never get an offer competitive to like what I currently had and what I could currently get. So to me, I've looked at it as I was like, well, you've basically just eliminated a huge set of potential candidates because what you're doing isn't competitive for the ones who, at least have other offers. So in some ways, it kind of felt like they were taking advantage of the people who wanted some of the perks they offered but couldn't get that offer somewhere else.
Right.
Now, the fact that you said that you try to share this up front or early on in the process, that helps a lot. In my mind, like if the salary is transparent, non-negotiable, and for the role, it's nice. I think most people agree that seeing salary ranges up front is awesome for employers or for employees, but that's a rarity, I think.
Yeah. I think it can be used. There's a couple different takes on it, right? Like you can use non-negotiable salaries to save money. Like it can be used for sort of the wrong reasons, or used, I don't want to say used for evil, but like, you know what I mean? The motivations can be less than altruistic. And I'm not suggesting that in the, in GitLab that was necessarily the case, but you can use it to be like, well, we're going to actively underpay people, and we're going to build a team around people that don't realize they're being undervalued, which can be a side effect if you're doing it wrong, right? And another counterpoint is like most people these days are trained to negotiate or taught to negotiate or told to negotiate, and so they're ready for that process. And when you say like, on face value, you say we don't negotiate salaries, sorry, that can come off a bit weird, and that can be, you have to add the part of like, and we give really good offers, and we try to be really competitive in the market, and we make sure that everyone is at the same level. Like you have to add those additional points, otherwise it gets dangerous, right?
I could definitely see it being, it's almost like you go to a used car lot and they're like, we don't negotiate prices, like these are the best price we can offer. But then you find out later that like if you're trading in a car, they'll negotiate that price though. So it's like you do technically negotiate prices, then you just do it in a different way. So
yeah, some people will not, like, they won't negotiate cash, but they'll negotiate options, or they'll negotiate vacation time. Like you can't have some of it. You got to be all in, right?
Yeah, I think that would be a huge thing, is that you have to like commit to, this is what's fair and we're going to be upfront and honest. Otherwise, it would be very frustrating as an employee down the road.
What I like about it is that it really does help those that aren't confident going into doing negotiations. And honestly, like that isn't part of our job really. So in a way, it shouldn't be a requirement of getting well compensated. I happen to be all right at it. Watch this. John, can I have $2,000, please? Can I?
No, Matt, you cannot.
Oh, okay.
Not
it
for
doesn't
me.
always work.
Where do I wire it? Just let me know.
Yeah.
It worked on me. You're good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I've seen
when
Matt's
you
work.
do, I'd love to see your interview process. Do you go in and say like, right, have a game of Snake on a whiteboard?
What's the best move? You have 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. How far do you do look ahead in real time?
Yeah, it's actually good questions, to be fair.
Yeah. I mean, we're a small team. We're only 3 full-time people. I think we're going to go to 4 full-time people in a little bit. But we're very, very small doing this, and we're very lucky and very fortunate to be able to do it. And we're supported by some really good partners that let us do that. So we haven't had to do strong interviewing yet, but I think that's an interesting, there's an interesting advantage here where our community, our users are all developers, and they're all very familiar with it. And they've seen the rules, they played around with it, you know what I mean? They're very familiar coming in, and so I'd like to think we could hire from the community pretty well.
Yeah, I find that to be one of the greatest things about open source is the people you meet doing it. And I do often recommend to young developers or new people that are new to development to get into some open source project if you can in some way, because the opportunities are amazing. And you're right, as somebody, if you're looking for somebody to hire, if you've already been working with them for a while, it becomes a very easy decision to make.
Is a new developer getting into any company that has developer facing like tools of any sort? Is my suggestion, like one of the suggestions I've given, is to try to use those tools. Like as an example, back when Stripe was earlier on, if you wanted to get involved with Stripe, you might have used their API clients and basically provided feedback of like, this was my experience. Here are the things that did well or didn't do well. And I think if you get into an interview process, that's going to make yourself a lot more attractive rather than somebody who's like, oh, I've never even touched your API, but I want to work there. Right. And it's like, that's kind of a hard thing to believe right now. Now, granted, that also means you have to have the time to do it, which is unfortunate, but I think that's better than the whole blanket send your resume to 100 people versus like send it to like 4 or 5 that you give yourself the best chances possible with them.
I think it's worth considering.
I think those are functions of scale, right? Like if you're early Stripe and you have to move fast and you have to move quick, then there's clear advantages to bringing on someone who knows what they're doing. But if you're, current present day Stripe, you want, your hiring requirements are super high, right? Like obviously, but also you want to make sure that you're bringing in a very broad spectrum of experiences and technologies because you're just operating at such scale. So I think that changes over time, and I think that's okay. For that to sort of shift over the lifetime of a company or an engineering team specifically.
I was more viewing it as like the individual applying perspective.
Right.
I've seen some people that just literally blanket send a resume to every company they can, and then they wonder why they don't hear back. And it's like, I would rather sit down and spend a week of like, here are the 5 companies I'm applying to this week. How do I make myself have the best chances possible? But that's just, I guess, my perspective. I haven't done the whole new junior developer trying to get a job thing. Like I only had to do that once and I got lucky. So it's hard to give advice on that front. Though.
Another good Netflix show. Dress John up like a schoolboy with a little cap on and that, little shorts.
Popping undercover junior. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's the other way around.
I've got like a schoolboy uniform and I'm going to job interviews and I'm just wondering where I'm.
Little catapult that you've got walking around, chewing gum. Right. Perfect. I mean, come on, it writes itself.
I would watch it. I'd watch it twice. Watch that.
Yeah. All right. Brad, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you and great to hear about Battlesnake. Anybody who wants to check it out, it's at battlesnake.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's play.battlesnake.com. We're just opening up our summer league. So it's our summer competitive league. Pre-registration just opened up yesterday. So if you want to get involved, you got a few weeks to get your snake ready. And then competitive play for the summer league will start in June.
Awesome. Brilliant. Thank you for joining us.
This. Yeah.
And then there's some outro music.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So we're still technically live. Just so you know, we usually wait a little bit to shut that off. I'm going to go through. We can stop your audio recording. We went a little bit over. Hope that's okay.
Yeah, it's good conversation.
Save.
Export. This is where it's really boring for our live.
Right. A bunch of logistics.
Lots of logistics. I always have to make sure I'm not forgetting anything.
Brad, when you mentioned the natural progression for developers earlier, I was thinking that like whenever I'm on my own, that's basically the same natural progression I've got. Don't hit into any walls, try not to hit myself, and then I have to go and find some food.
It's rules for life, really. Yeah.
Exactly.
We should
Actually,
just start teaching it sooner.
Yeah, there is a real one though, which is that sometimes you can't beat somebody else by doing the same thing better. So you do something different.
Right.
And I think that's a real lesson. I think that in startups in particular, you can't sometimes beat somebody doing something playing their game, but you can play a slightly different game. Battlesnake.
Change the rules.
Yeah.
Change the rules.
Can I do like an audio intro ident for you, like Battlesnake, and then you can use that on the thing?
I don't know, maybe this is, let me see if I can find it. Someone made a theme song for us like 3 years ago.
Did they?
Like a Battlesnake. Let me see if I can dig it up. If anyone on the Battlesnake team is watching and you can find it, you can link it to me and I'll share it, because we're still live on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
I did give you a link to upload your audio.
It is uploading now.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hopefully won't conflict with the Zoom too much. Let me see if I can find this theme song, because it's funny. Did you want to run some games?
Doesn't really matter to me. My AI is pretty bad. I've learned. I was messing around with different ones just to sort of see what sort of turned out with him. And it was kind of interesting to see the patterns that you'd run into without potentially trying for them. Yeah. Like if you're telling your snake to avoid food, you end up like just spiraling pretty easily without really trying to, because the food just tends to spawn all around you, and it's kind of the safe place to be, is just do that loop.
Yeah. We call it tail chasing. Like tail chasing is sort of like it's a very early accidental strategy. And then you realize how quickly the limitations of it. Yeah.
Actually, it's quite good. I used to do that when I played the real game. I'd follow the tail around because I knew it would always move ahead.
Because it was always safe, right? It's your guaranteed safe spot because you know it's going to move out of the way until you eat food. Yeah. But yeah, we had the very first Battlesnake ever. There's this whole angle, and I realize I'm talking about it a lot. There's a whole angle of like we have legendary Battlesnakes. Like there's this whole lore between like undefined behavior and tofu. And the very first Battlesnake competition we ran was won by a snake named Chicken Snake. And that's all it did, is it just chased its tail in the corner. And I mentioned that like that's how we realized that we had to have a health mechanic, because otherwise you could just chase your own tail indefinitely and you could win every game, which is exactly what they did.
Yeah, that's great. You must be, I mean, do you anticipate you're going to get any more surprises like that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That require changes to the game mechanics, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we will, and I suspect we will. And we're getting to a point now where we're thinking of actually lowering the timeout as well from 500 milliseconds and making it something a little bit quicker, because people are just able to do so much in 500 milliseconds. Like it's a lot of time, and especially if you're co-locating. Like we have people with response times that are like single digits, and so it's possible at that stage. The other thing, and we didn't even talk about this, but there's other game mode. So there's a Battlesnake Royale mode where the board edges kind of shrink in on you, and we have a 3v3 mode where you can cross your teammates but you can't cross the opponents. And so that introduces a whole new level of like mechanics and strategy that we've only sort of begun to figure out.
I imagine you could start to introduce all sorts of things like power-ups on the board or something like that there's a lot of options, I guess, to sort of spice it up in the future. And you were even talking about like timeouts. I could even see a mode where like the higher tier you are, the lower your timeout is.
Yes.
To sort of give those beginners a better chance to get started, and then their goal is to optimize what they have working.
Yeah, like maybe at a silver or gold tier, you have a second to kind of figure it out. So we're not like if Heroku spikes your latency. Or the other idea we've had is actually to give forgiveness. I don't know what the word is for it. But basically, like you can time out 3 times, and that's okay. We'll just replay the request. But if you time out a 4th time, or maybe it's 1 out of every 100 turns or 2 out of every 100 turns, we'll let it slide to build in. Because if you're on Heroku for the first time and you don't know how Heroku works, and you don't understand that like it goes down every once in a while, the latency spikes every once in a while. That's a really garbage way to lose a game, right?
I could see like high-end players taking advantage of that, sort of like in football games or something, where they like try to time that timeout at the exact right moment.
Yeah. We haven't had anyone like spin up like DDoS attacks against Heroku yet. Or like, imagine if you're trying. We did originally, the game accidentally showed everyone's URL. So like obviously like you could spam it with requests, but the really smart players started to send the board state against the URL to see what their move was. And then use that. Yeah. And so we go to great lengths right now to hide the URL, but that was a concern. There will always be like weird things like that crop up.
Yeah.
It's a fun problem for us though.
Of course, yeah. It's almost a game in itself, isn't it? Really, keeping the engine good. Soon, one day in the future, you'll have battling game engines, Battlesnake engine battles. That'll be good.
I don't
we
think
need
it's
something
possible
for the next season.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible to make any sort of game without people trying to exploit something in it or cheat in some way.
Yeah.
At least a popular game. The unpopular ones might not get it so much.
Yeah. Yeah, like I like it when they do those. They try and complete levels as fast as possible. Someone did Portal one where they just found, even they knew about glitches and all sorts in the level, and they just run through the level as fast as they can, and it's insane. You can find them on YouTube. They're really great.
I'm trying to think of like what a Battlesnake speed run is. Are you speed running the code or are you speed running the snake itself? Like I think it's interesting. Yeah. You like cumulative time, like what's your total latency across the whole game, and the shortest one wins.
You could almost do it like chess, where it's like, here's your allotted response time. When you run out at the end of the game, you're done.
And like every turn, we drip you like another 100 milliseconds or something to play with. Like we'll slowly add to your pool, but you can spend it however you want.
If you could collect time as the snake as well.
That would be interesting. You like for every you get 3 turns of a full 1 second compute time, but only you and not everyone else. This is where like the fun for us happens in like obviously chasing down all the unique things that come across, but also like programming that game engine is really, really fun, right? Like it's one thing to program the AIs, it's a whole other thing to program the game engine that's trying to account for all this stuff, and doing like latency pools and different food mechanics and this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's really great. What a great project.
I'm gonna
I think somebody has the SoundCloud for the
I dropped it in Slack.
Okay.
In the GoTime FM channel.
Okay, that was you. Okay, cool.
I'm also going to put this I put a join link in there. John, if you could go there and add, I want to see your snake in action.
Oh, I gotta make sure my server's even up.
Yeah,
I think it is. Like I've been running locally, just using ngrok. So
okay.
Like by far, no optimizations are done for response time.
That's great though. So let's see. Can I share my screen? If I share my screen, will that come through?
I think. I should say I don't. My strategy was something between I was toying with one that avoided food and one that went for food and just kind of rotated back and forth when it was about to starve. But I don't remember where it ended up because I was trying a couple other things too.
So I don't know if anyone's still watching. There's a few people still watching the stream. If you're in the stream and you can see the Slack channel, anyone can click that link and can add a snake if they want to. I'll put it in our Discord too, because we'll probably have some people watching.
They're gonna see my very bad snake.
I'm excited for it though. Okay, so you can see my screen well enough. Try to make it a little bit bigger. Let's see if we can get some games going.
What's your snake called, John?
Hungry Hippo.
Nice.
Originally, I was going to make a snake that just tried to eat as much food as possible. And then I didn't have enough time to sort of finish all the stuff. Like it'll probably do this in this game, actually. It's if you make like that U shape, it'll eventually try to dive into itself headed towards food and not realize like, oh, there's my own body blocking me from getting there. And it turns out poorly.
So we've got a little like best of 3 set up. So this is my badly coded snake, which is I built this one back in the fall, and like I did this live on stream based off of viewer suggestions. So it's not terribly intelligent, but we'll see what happens. So we can just run the game here. Like you're already doing fine. There you go. You took me out 1v1.
People are gonna figure out where I am.
Hang on, did he win that?
You
I
won
won
it,
that
yeah.
because his badly coded snake decided to suicide.
We can back up. So what
Or I
happened
guess I
here is
blocked
like
him.
you blocked me. Like that was a bait, right?
That wasn't intentional. I was probably
coulda
going to eat food.
Are you you have to have some code in there to avoid me, because otherwise you would have like.
Oh yeah, I have code to avoid people. Like
Okay.
the code is there to avoid people, and like that was the first thing I coded was just like don't kill myself, don't run into other snakes, all the things you mentioned. Those are all there.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes my snake likes to get into a spot where he can't avoid things.
So this is a situation where like if you look at my length, like I'm the pink one on this graph. This is my length over time. Like you're just not even trying to eat food. You eat exactly 0 food and you still destroy me.
I'm pretty sure the snake right now is set up to go like it doesn't try to eat food unless it's below like 50 health or something.
This is like a real thing. You have this. What are you talking about? This is a real strategy. You're like,
yeah, it's a real
like
strategy.
gold tier.
He's hustled you to make that $2,000 I made.
I had to get my bet in. All right.
We always joke internally of like, what's the Battlesnake fantasy league? Like, what's the equivalent? When do we go? When do we hit DraftKings and just you can just start betting against it.
You were talking about I don't know if we mentioned this when we were talking about it, but you were talking about like different companies making Battlesnakes as well.
Yeah.
And I remember when I worked at, I don't know why I ran into you, but I guess my snake
that was
decided...
like, it's like 50-50, right?
Oh, okay, that's why.
Yeah.
It wasn't there
both
already.
spots you could have potentially gone to, so it probably just picks one at random.
Yeah. And then I'm gonna go into it because I had the length advantage, so I don't even look at you. Like I'm not even considering where you're moving because I know that you're smaller than me.
Oh, really?
But like when we were talking about companies doing this, I remember there was I think it was at Google. They had like an intercompany, I think it was League of Legends.
Yeah,
like tournament.
You're talking about
actually it was like Amazon
after hours gaming league.
That was one of them, but I swear there was another one that was just more of a friendly one, like where different people do it, like without being casted or anything even. And I could definitely see this being something that would be fun to do in that sense, because it's, I mean, you could one have programmers, but two, if you have people at the company who want to learn programming and like they want to join some programmers to like get a feel for what it's like, it would be a fun way to do it and like do it as a team sport.
I really like that approach. Like now we're just getting philosophical, but I really like the approach of like, if you have a team of 3 and like 2 of them are programmers but one of them is not looking to program necessarily, then there's enough strategy. You know what I mean? Like you can just talk, like find these edge cases, right? Find these edge cases, think about how we want to act in them. And then there's definitely like, there's enough, of not actual coding, and because the game is so strategic, but also so accessible, most people can contribute.
So I do have a question for you since I've got you here. I didn't look at the rules to see exactly how this is handled. You had mentioned tail chasing. If I move into the spot where my tail currently is, like obviously I have to be bigger than 2. I learned that the hard way. But like if you're going in a circle and you move into the spot where your tail is, do you die in the current version?
If you're in the middle and you move into a spot where your tail is,
like let's say you're 4 length and you're like in a square shape. If you move to where your tail is, so like technically your tail should move out of the way as you move in.
Yes.
Does that lead to a death at this point?
No, and there's a couple, like that's actually a really safe move, for a couple reasons. One, it prevents food spawn, so we're not gonna, like if your tail is there, we're not gonna spawn food on that spot, and if your head moves into it, we're not gonna spawn food on that spot. We also never spawn food in front of you because we've had some like very, I would say unfair eliminations, because you're only forced to go in one way, and we happen to put food right there, and it screws over your whole strategy. And so we've kind of adjusted for a little bit like that. But the thing is, like, what's interesting about that strategy is you can start to get cocky and you can think like, okay, I can follow any tail. But then if you start to follow other people's tails and you learn that they can eat, and then their tail will stay put and you will run into it. So
one of the first things I coded was trying to chase my own. Like I actually knew to break those 2 up, like chasing somebody else's tail. I have to actually look, can they eat right now? And if so, this is not a safe move. But for my own tail, I was like, well, I can go there anytime. Well, I completely forgot that when you start as a length 2 snake, your tail is like basically you double down on yourself.
It's stacked. Yeah.
So like all my first moves were just my snake killing myself. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on right now. Like, why am I just dying in one move?
Yeah.
So that was a fun debugging.
We were
That's
talking just yesterday about actually building some basic, because we like your first move should be to try to stay on the board. I think like wall detection is the easiest sort of first one, and a lot of people get tripped up on that. Like they'll just run into themselves because it doesn't look like you're stacked, and no one's looking at the code, or no one's looking at the request bodies closely enough to realize that you are actually length 3, but you're only on one square. And so a lot of people get tripped up by that. I think we should try to move that. Really.
I was gonna say length 2. I guess I said it was length 2. All I know is I would like go up and then down and basically right where my tail was, because I'd always assume if my tail's there, I'm good.
Yeah.
Brad, what's your Twitter? Are you on Twitter? Sorry, because
it's just at B
put it in
Van
the show
Vugt.
notes. Sorry, it's what?
At B Van Vugt. I can put a link.
Thank you. Yeah, because we'll put it in the show notes too, in case anyone wants to follow you.
How do I chat? There you go. On the Zoom.
Thank you.
I don't know if those chats actually show up in.
Oh, I'm already.
Yeah, I don't know.
Or not.
Does it show up? I was thinking about that. That's
No, I
fine.
don't think so.
So this is
okay
game
to put it in
3.
the show notes.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
right?
that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
This is the one for all the money.
This is the one. This is the one for Matt's $2,000.
Tiebreaker.
The loser has to pay him.
Yeah, the loser. Yeah, the loser has to send him the money.
Oh, they're doing all right. What are you doing, John?
This is pretty good.
Oh, this is good. This is.
Oh, what happened?
I got
What
stuck by
happened?
your tail.
You got
Oh,
trapped.
Oh,
right there. So
I
that
think
was.
you ate.
I ate that food. I ate 2 food, and that trapped you out. That's funny.
Oh, that's so great.
See, Brad's not telling everybody he's got a rigged server.
Yeah, I'm doing full just like a 200 node neural net. It's just all right.
It's just badly coded. It's still
it's badly coded, but it's still very good.
Yeah,
very
it's
functional.
A farm of AI. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I have to go, but this was what a great episode. Thank you so much, Brad.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was fun hanging out with both of you.
Yeah,
Yep. Thank you, Brad. I'm actually going to go
See
myself, but definitely check it out if anybody wants to do some Battlesnake.
Oh yeah, I forgot we were at the podcast. Should say goodbye to everyone else as well. Thanks for watching live.
Yeah. Thanks, YouTube, for hanging out. Awesome.